Chapter 19 of Sylvia's Lovers by Elizabeth Gaskell. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Terence Callan. Chapter 19, An Important Mission. Philip was too late for the coach he had hoped to go by, but there was another that left at night, and which reached Newcastle in the forenoon, so that by the loss of a night's sleep he might overtake his lost time. But restless and miserable, he could not stop in Hartlepool longer than to get some hasty food at the inn from which the coach started. He acquainted himself with the names of the towns through which it would pass, and the inns at which it would stop, and left word that the coachman was to be on the lookout for him, and pick him up at some one of these places. He was thoroughly worn out before this happened, too much tired to gain any sleep in the coach. When he reached Newcastle, he went to engage his passage in the next London-bound smack, and then directed his steps to Robinson's, in the side, to make all the inquiries he could think of respecting the plough his uncle wanted to know about. So it was pretty late in the afternoon, indeed almost evening, before he arrived at the small inn on the quayside where he intended to sleep. It was but a rough kind of place, frequented principally by sailors. He had been recommended to it by Daniel Robson, who had known it well in former days. The accommodation in it was, however, clean and homely, and the people keeping it were respectable enough in their way. Still, Hepburn was rather repelled by the appearance of the sailors, who sate drinking in the bar, and he asked in a low voice if there was not another room. The woman stared in surprise and only shook her head. Hepburn went to a separate table away from the roaring fire, which on this cold March evening was the great attraction, and called for food and drink. Then, seeing that the other men were eyeing him with the sociable idea of speaking to him, he asked for pen and ink and paper, with the intention of defeating their purpose by preoccupation on his part. But when the paper came, the new pen, the unused thickened ink, he hesitated long before he began to write, and at last he slowly put down the words, "Dear and honored uncle." There was a pause. His meal was brought and hastily swallowed. Even while he was eating it, he kept occasionally touching up the letters of these words. When he had drunk a glass of ale, he began again to write, fluently this time, for he was giving an account of the plough. Then came another long stop. He was weighing in his own mind what he should say about Kinraid. Once he thought for a second of writing to Sylvia herself and telling her how much. She might treasure up her lover's words like grains of gold, while they were lighter than dust in their meaning to Philip's mind, words which such as the specksioneer used as counters to beguile and lead astray silly women. It was for him to prove his constancy by action, and the chances of his giving such proof were infinitesimal in Philip's estimation. But should the latter mention the bare fact of Kinraid's impressment to Robson? That would have been the natural course of things, remembering that the last time Philip had seen either, they were in each other's company. 20 times he put his pen to the paper with the intention of relating briefly the event that had befallen Kinraid, and as often he stopped as though the first word would be irrevocable. While he thus sate, pen in hand, thinking himself wiser than conscience, and looking on beyond the next step which she bade him take into an indefinite future, he caught some fragments of the sailors' talk at the other end of the room, which made him listen to their words. They were speaking of that very Kinraid, the thought of whom filled his own mind like an actual presence. In a rough, careless way they spoke of the specksioneer, with admiration enough for his powers as a sailor and harpooner, and from that they passed on to jesting mention of his power amongst women, and one or two girls' names were spoken of in connection with him. Hepburn silently added Annie Coulson and Sylvia Robson to this list, and his cheeks turned paler as he did so. Long after they had done speaking about Kinraid, after they had paid their shot and gone away, he sate in the same attitude, thinking bitter thoughts. The people of the house prepared for bed. Their silent guest took no heed of their mute signs. At length the landlord spoke to him, and he started, gathered his wits together with an effort, and prepared to retire with the rest. But before he did so, he signed and directed the letter to his uncle, leaving it still open, however, in case some sudden feeling should prompt him to add a postscript. The landlord volunteered the information that the letter his guest had been writing must be posted early the next morning, if it was going south, as the mails in that direction only left Newcastle every other day. All night long Hepburn wearied himself with passionate tossings, prompted by stinging recollection. Towards morning he fell into a dead sound sleep. He was roused by a hasty knocking at the door. It was broad, full daylight. He had overslept himself, and the smack was leaving by the early tide. He was even now summoned on board. He dressed, wafered his letter, and rushed with it to the neighboring post office, and without caring to touch the breakfast for which he had paid, he embarked. Once on board, he experienced the relief which it always is to an undecided man, and generally is at first to anyone who has been paltering with duty, when circumstances decide for him. In the first case, it is pleasant to be relieved from the burden of decision. In the second, the responsibility seems to be shifted onto impersonal events. And so Philip sailed out of the mouth of the Tyne onto the great open sea. It would be a week before the smack reached London, even if she pursued a tolerably straight course, but she had to keep a sharp lookout after possible impressment of her crew, and it was not until after many dodges and some adventures that at the end of a fortnight from the time of his leaving Monkshaven, Philip found himself safely housed in London, and ready to begin the delicate piece of work which was given him to do. He felt himself fully capable of unraveling each clue to information and deciding on the value of the knowledge so gained. But during the leisure of the voyage he had wisely determined to communicate everything he learnt about Dickinson, in short, every step he took in the matter, by letter to his employers, and thus his mind, both in and out of his lodgings, might have appeared to have been fully occupied with the concerns of others. But there were times when the miserable luxury of dwelling upon his own affairs was his, when he lay down in his bed till he fell into restless sleep, when the point to which his steps tended in his walks was ascertained. Then he gave himself up to memory and regret, which often deepened into despair, and but seldom was cheered by hope. He grew so impatient of the ignorance in which he was kept, for in those days of heavy postage any correspondence he might have had on mere Monkshaven intelligence was very limited, as to the affairs at Haytersbank, that he cut out an advertisement respecting some new kind of plough from a newspaper that lay in the chop-house where he usually dined, and rising early the next morning, he employed the time thus gained in going round to the shop where these new ploughs were sold. That night he wrote another letter to Daniel Robson with a long account of the merits of the implements he had that day seen. With a sick heart and a hesitating hand, he wound up with a message of regard to his aunt and to Sylvia, an expression of regard which he dared not make as warm as he wished, and which, consequently, fell below the usual mark attained by such messages, and would have appeared to anyone who cared to think about it as cold and formal. When this letter was dispatched, Hepburn began to wonder what he had hoped for in writing it. He knew that Daniel could write, or rather that he could make strange hieroglyphics, the meaning of which puzzled others and often himself, but these pen and ink signs were seldom employed by Robson, and never, so far as Philip knew, for the purpose of letter writing. But still he craved so for news of Sylvia, even for a sight of paper which she had seen, and perhaps touched, that he thought all his trouble about the plough, to say nothing of the 1 and 2 postage which he had prepaid in order to make sure of his letter's reception in the frugal household at Haytersbank, well lost for the mere chance of his uncle's caring enough for the intelligence to write in reply, or even to get some friend to write an answer. For in such case, perhaps, Philip might see her name mentioned in some way, even though it was only that she sent her duty to him. But the post office was dumb. No letter came from Daniel Robson. Philip heard, it is true, from his employers pretty frequently on business, and he felt sure they would have named it if any ill had befallen his uncle's family, for they knew of the relationship and of his intimacy there. They generally ended their formal letters with as formal a summary of Monkshaven news, but there was never a mention of the Robsons, and that of itself was well, but it did not soothe Philip's impatient curiosity. He had never confided his attachment to his cousin to anyone. It was not his way. But he sometimes thought that if Coulson had not taken his present appointment to a confidential piece of employment so ill, he would have written to him and asked him to go up to Haytersbank Farm and let him know how they all were. All this time he was transacting the affair on which he had been sent with great skill, and indeed in several ways he was quietly laying the foundation for enlarging the business in Monkshaven. Naturally grave and quiet, and slow to speak, he impressed those who saw him with the idea of greater age and experience than he really possessed. Indeed, those who encountered him in London thought he was absorbed in the business of money-making. Yet before the time came when he could wind up affairs and return to Monkshaven, he would have given all he possessed for a letter from his uncle telling him something about Sylvia. For he still hoped to hear from Robson, although he knew that he hoped against reason. But we often convince ourselves by good argument that what we wish for need never have been expected, and then at the end of our reasoning find that we might have saved ourselves the trouble, for that our wishes are untouched, and are as strong enemies to our peace of mind as ever. Hepburn's balked hope was the Mordecai sitting in Haman's gate. All his success in his errand to London, his well-doing in worldly affairs, was tasteless, and gave him no pleasure, because of this blank and void of all intelligence concerning Sylvia. And yet he came back with a letter from the Fosters in his pocket, curt yet expressive of deep gratitude for his discreet services in London, and at another time, in fact, if Philip's life had been ordered differently to what it was, it might have given this man a not unworthy pleasure to remember that, without a penny of his own, simply by diligence, honesty, and faithful quick-sightedness as to the interests of his masters, he had risen to hold the promise of being their successor, and to be ranked by them as a trusted friend. As the Newcastle smack neared the shore on her voyage home, Hepburn looked wistfully out for the faint gray outline of Monkshaven Priory against the sky, and the well-known cliffs, as if the masses of inanimate stone could tell him any news of Sylvia. In the streets of Shields, just after landing, he encountered a neighbor of the Robsons and an acquaintance of his own. By this honest man he was welcomed as a great traveler is welcomed on his return from a long voyage, with many hearty good shakes of the hand, much repetition of kind wishes, and offers to treat him to drink. Yet from some insurmountable feeling, Philip avoided all mention of the family, who were the principal bond between the honest farmer and himself. He did not know why, but he could not bear the shock of first hearing her name in the open street, or in the rough public-house, and thus he shrank from the intelligence he craved to hear. Thus he knew no more about the Robsons when he returned to Monkshaven than he had done on the day when he had last seen them. And of course his first task there was to give a long, viva voce account of all his London proceedings to the two brothers Foster, who, considering that they had heard the result of everything by letter, seemed to take an insatiable interest in details. He could hardly tell why, but even when released from the Fosters' parlor, he was unwilling to go to Haytersbank Farm. It was late, it is true, but on a May evening even country people keep up till 8 or 9 o'clock. Perhaps it was because Hepburn was still in his travel-stained dress, having gone straight to the shop on his arrival in Monkshaven. Perhaps it was because if he went this night for the short half-hour intervening before bedtime, he would have no excuse for paying a longer visit on the following evening. At any rate, he proceeded straight to Alice Rose's as soon as he had finished his interview with his employers. Both Hester and Coulson had given him their welcome home in the shop, which they had, however, left an hour or two before him. Yet they gave him a fresh greeting, almost one in which surprise was blended, when he came to his lodgings. Even Alice seemed gratified by his spending this first evening with them, as if she had thought it might have been otherwise. Weary though he was, he exerted himself to talk and to relate what he had done and seen in London, as far as he could without breaking confidence with his employers. It was something to see the pleasure he gave to his auditors, although there were several mixed feelings in their minds to produce the expression of it which gratified him. Coulson was sorry for his former ungenerous reception of the news that Philip was going to London. Hester and her mother each secretly began to feel as if this evening was like more happy evenings of old, before the Robsons came to Haytersbank Farm. And who knows what faint delicious hopes this resemblance may not have suggested. While Philip, restless and excited, feeling that he could not sleep, was glad to pass away the waking hours that must intervene before tomorrow night, at times he tried to make them talk of what had happened in Monkshaven during his absence, but all had gone on in an eventless manner, as far as he could gather. If they knew of anything affecting the Robsons, they avoided speaking of it to him. And indeed, how little likely were they ever to have heard their names while he was away. End of chapter 19.